Hello everyone. Thank you all for joining. What I'm going to be talking about today is the top 10 ways that you can achieve a successful data migration. So this is something that we've been doing for a long time. I think it's an important aspect to cover and give people an opportunity to gain a little bit from our experience, understand what we've found has worked and what hasn't worked in some cases out on projects. So if I want to just start, we'll go, what I'm going to talk about during the course of the presentation is a brief introduction, which we've just gone through, cover what we define as data migration, why it's so important to plan, and then the top 10 ways to achieve a successful migration, and then we can go on and answer any questions that you might have during the course of the webinar. So what is data migration? So data migration is the process of basically transferring data from one place to another. And that can be from different storage types or formats, and it can be from different computer systems and applications. In the old days, whether they're good old days or bad old days, as the case may be, that used to be done very, very manually. People basically used to use Excel spreadsheets and manually transfer flat files between applications. Nowadays, the aim is to do this programmatically, so that as much of the data migration as possible can be automated, and that frees up human resources to do other more value-added tasks than just physically moving data from one place to another. So the sort of areas where we see data migration playing an important role is when people are implementing new ERP, CRM, HCM, SCM type systems, during the course of mergers and acquisitions where it's critical that the acquired or merging companies actually have a common reference set of data. Things like when people are implementing data warehouses, doing a legacy update, system harmonization, those sorts of things. So there's a number of areas where data migration plays a critical role in the successful implementation of what is quite often one of the largest improvement projects that organizations undertake. Just an example of some data that was gathered during a recent survey by the Americas SAP user group, where they actually went out and surveyed nearly 100 companies who were implementing a large ERP, and basically 93% of them said that they had significant data management issues during the course of their project. And if you look at the graph that you can see up on the slide now, you'll see that more than 75% of those experienced data management issues late in the project. And by late in the project, we mean during realization, or during final prep, or during go live. And there was a group of poor customers who actually realized that they had data issues after they went live, and actually had the issue of, well, what do I do now? Because it's so much harder to go back after you've gone and put this brand new system in, and after you've gone and spent all the money implementing it and training users, to then have to go back and clean the data after you've gone live with a brand new system. So the whole point of what we want to talk about today is give you some insights, give you 10 key areas where you can focus on that will ensure that you're not in that group of people that find out that they have a data issue after go live, and that you can be in the group of people that find out that they have issues with their data early in the project, during the project prep phase, or during the business blueprint phase. And that gives people significant extra time to be able to deal with and manage any issues that they may have with their data in their legacy system before they move it into their brand new system. So let's have a talk about the first step. One of the first steps is to understand exactly what the quality is of the data that you've got in your legacy system now. How well do the definitions that you've got in your legacy systems match the definitions that you're going to need in your new system? How well Do the mandatory fields that are required by the new system, how well does the legacy data fit those mandatory requirements? What sort of data standards are going to be applied? Is the new system going to require things like compliance with USPS address data standards, whereas your legacy system may not have that? So it's very important to actually understand what you actually have in your legacy system and how that may be applied in your new system. And we call it the as-is assessment, or a data health assessment, where we actually look at what the quality of the data is in the legacy system and how that would impact or have what possible impacts that may have during the course of a data migration project. The other reason for doing the as-is assessment is to do things like identify obsolete data, identify data that you don't need to move, stuff that is, vendors and materials that have never had a purchase order raised against them, duplicates that are in the data, those sorts of things, so you can actually reduce the amount of data that you have to move in the first place. Every piece of data that you move is something that has to be validated, something that has to be cleansed, something that has to be transformed. So if you can actually go through and set some criteria for pruning that in the first place, then that actually helps you during the course of the data migration project as well. The second thing is, as I said, is to look at not just what data you've got, but what quality is it going to have to be when it goes into the new system. What standards need to be applied? Is it fit for use? Is it going to actually meet the business process requirements that you're putting in your new system? That gives you the ability to identify how much of that cleansing, how much of that standardization, how much of that enrichment can be automated, and how much of it is going to need manual input from the business. And I think this is a critical aspect during a data migration project, and we'll talk about it as one of the other steps, is that if you think that a tool is going to be able to do 100% of this work, then you're probably going to be very disappointed when you find out that it can't. So the third step is around making sure that you've defined the business rules and validated those business rules with the business, with the people who are configuring the new system. I can't stress enough the number of times that we find that people say, oh, let's just get started. Let's just go and do an extract and hop in and start cleaning this data, without actually defining what do we mean by clean. What's going to mean that the data is actually business ready? We find that the more time we spend defining the business rules, clearly understanding what the new system is going to require, clearly understanding what we're going to need to do to the legacy system to make it business ready, the better the first pass is at the cleansing and the migration work, the better results that you get from the automated process, and the less stress you place on people towards the end of the project when they're all busy trying to do other testing, where you've actually managed to get rid of most of the data issues early in the process, and they're able to test with relatively clean data, which means that they're more focused on the system testing rather than complaining about the fact that the data they've got in the system doesn't make any sense. So it's absolutely critical to get that initial input, spend some time defining the business rules, make sure that everybody understands what's going to be acceptable and what's not going to be acceptable when it goes into the new system. And that leads to the fourth point, which is understand the purpose of your data. You need to understand where and how the data is going to get used in the new system. You need to understand what's going to be different tomorrow from the way this particular set of data is being used today. There's lots of things that can drive that. Changes in regulations, changes in your business process, changes in the ownership of data, right? Someone who did something, who had a particular role before in the legacy system may have a completely different role now when the new system is implemented, and they need to understand how this data is going to be used and what the purpose of the data is. I always take the view that if someone can't tell me how they're going to use the data, then you've really got to question the value of that information, and you need to go back to step number 3 and say, well, why am I actually moving this data over in the first place? So it's really critical to understand, well, how's this data going to be used, who's going to be using it, what's it going to be used for, where's it going to be used, all those sorts of things. The other important part during that phase is to understand that there's probably going to be more than one user of the data. So when you actually move this data across into the new system, make sure that you talk to all of the users of the data, because some people may say, well, these 3 fields are important and the others I don't care about. But when you go and talk to another group of users of that data, say, oh, no, those 3 fields are okay, but I also need this one, this one, this one. So it's absolutely critical to understand exactly how this data is going to get used in the new system. And that leads on to the 5th one, and this is something that we find a lot of people don't take into account, in that the people who are going to be responsible for the data after go live, for some reason or other, people don't think it's important to have those people involved in the project itself. Right? So at the point of go live, it's like, okay, here you are, here's the data, all clean, and then those people are then expected to take responsibility for that data once the new system has gone live. We find that happens more times than I'd like to count, and I still haven't come up with a reason as to why people don't see it as important to have the future owners of the data involved in the project during the course of the project. So I think one of these things is important, that you need to identify the final owner of the data, make sure that they have input into the standards and the business rules that are being applied. They need to understand what their roles and responsibilities are going to be after go live, and also understand what's going to be required to keep this data clean, what's going to be required to make sure that it stays fit for purpose when the new system goes in place and users start creating brand new data. And this is an interesting one, taking internal responsibility for your data migration. So at the end of the day, the people who have to live with this data are you. It's your business users. It's the people who are going to be using the new system. You need to take ownership of the data, but that doesn't mean that you have to do all of the work during the migration yourself. As we talked about before, there are different ways of doing data migration. The old way used to be completely manual, where you basically sit a lot of people in a room, give them computer terminals and say, here, please go and clean this data up in these 300 Excel spreadsheets that we've given to you. The world has changed. There are now tools out there that can help automate 85–90% of that effort. But at the end of the day, you still need to take ownership and make sure that the business is involved in the validation, in the setting of the business rules. The more time they spend involved in that analysis and setting of the business rules, the less time they will have to spend towards the end of the project fixing problems. And I can't stress that enough, that time spent early in the process of analyzing and defining the business rules pays huge dividends in the latter part of the project when people are really stressed getting ready for go live. If you can minimize the number of data issues they have during that phase, it makes a huge difference. And that's, I suppose, where we come in, because that's what our focus is, that's what our expertise is, in helping people migrate this data, cleanse the data, understanding what questions to ask to get the right business rules out of the business, so that we can try to automate as much as possible of the process and relieve people of those very manual tasks of having to go through and look at every single record and clean up every single record individually. And that leads to the next point, where, as I said, yes, there are tools available, and we use predominantly the SAP Business Objects Data Services tool suite for doing these sorts of data migrations, especially when we are migrating into an SAP environment. It makes sense to use a tool which is fully integrated into that landscape. But the tool cannot do everything. There will always be a certain percentage of records where it actually requires human intellect to look at it and say, nah, that's not right, it needs to look like this. And if we don't do that, if people aren't in a position to actually allocate some time to be able to do that, you will find that you will end up with that big rush at the end, where people are busy trying to get other things done, get training done, get user acceptance testing done, get system integration testing done, and at the end of the day, they just give data up, where they say, hey, that's good enough, let's just put it in what we've got now, right, and let's go with it, because we can't afford any more time. If you follow the process and follow the steps that we've been talking about, most of those data issues would have been dealt with before you get to that really, really stressful part of the project. You give people sufficient time to actually go and look for data if it happens to be missing. You give people time to go and liaise with other people in the organization and find out what the real values should be that are actually being moved into the new system. All right? And I think the other point that's important is making sure that you have validation steps throughout the process. Don't leave it to one big check at the end. We will typically do multiple cleansing iterations where the business is given exception files after we've defined the rules, after we've run the data through the cleansing cycles, so that they actually have multiple times when they can review the data. They get small chunks to actually review rather than one big chunk at the end with, please give it to me by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning and you only get it by 8 o'clock tonight. Those sorts of time pressures. If you put people under those sorts of time pressures, the likelihood that they will actually spend a significant amount of time and put the effort in to actually get it right is reduced, because they just don't have the time to focus on it. So one of the things that we would actually recommend is that you actually set up your test and validation procedures, understand who's going to be doing the validation, make sure they understand how they're going to be doing the validation, make sure they understand what the process is, make sure they understand who's going to be signing off and saying, hey, yeah, this data is business ready. I would be happy to run my new system with this data in it, which is really what they're saying. When they sign off on this data that's getting loaded into the new system, what they're really saying is, I will be happy to run my new system with this data in it. It won't have a negative impact on my ability to follow the new business processes. It won't slow me down. It won't cause me problems in some other part of my organization, that this data is business ready. And if you can get people to understand that that's what validation means, and that you've identified the people who are going to do that early in the process, and you give them the opportunity to be involved throughout the process so that they do it in small bits rather than one big bit at the end, then that makes life a lot easier for everyone involved in the project. Getting close to the end now, guys. Only 2 to go. All right. And I think this one is a critical one as well. That understand who knows the data best, and this is different in every organization. We've worked with organizations where it's actually the business users who understand the data best. They're the people that enter the data. They're the people that actually use the data on a daily basis, right? So they understand the data that they're putting into the system. Unfortunately, sometimes they only understand a very, very small part of the system, the part that they're exposed to, and they don't understand where that data goes to after it's entered by them. That's where you need to have the legacy system SMEs, the people who understand the legacy IT landscape, to say, hey, when you enter data in this field, it actually gets propagated out to here, 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 and here, right? So that you can actually then understand what the impact of poor data going into the system in one place, where that's going to end up and what impact it's going to have. So it's absolutely critical to understand who knows and understands the business data best. It's imperative that you actually involve those people during the project and have a clear understanding about what changes in one data field somewhere in the system are going to have on other aspects of the operation, and critical that it's also understand what that means from the point of view of both the legacy system, so what's happened in the legacy system, why certain things have been done the way they are, why people are using a text field in one part of the company for some particular information, but in a different part of the company, they're using exactly the same text field to store other information. So it's important to understand those nuances of how the data is getting used in the legacy systems, right? And then also, just as importantly, understand what that impact's going to be in the new system. So if you've got information that's going into the new system, where's it going to go? What impact's it going to have? As I said before, who's going to use it? What does it mean if I put poor data into that particular area in the new system? And I think the final one is all about measurement. Understand what the quality of data is. Understand what impact it's going to have on your new system. Understand who's going to measure it, who's going to sign off on it. What is acceptable? Is 99% acceptable? Does it have to be 100%? Is 92% acceptable? But understand from a business point of view what that 92, 95, 99% actually means, and understand what the cost of both achieving that level of quality and also the cost of not achieving that level of quality actually is. As you see on this slide here, sometimes you have to go slow to go fast, right? The number of times I see people say, I don't have time to do it right, but I have time to fix it 3 times afterwards, right? You're much better off, especially in the data area, of getting it right the first time. Spend the time in the initial phases of the project, understanding what needs to happen, right? You might not see a lot of clean data coming out of the process up front, right? But once you do get data coming out of the process, you'll know that it's going to meet the business requirements, and you know that it's going to be correct, and you won't have a lot of rework to do if you spend time up front going through these previous 9 steps that we've talked about, and make sure that you've actually focused on understanding first before you go and do the execution part of it. Don't just jump in and start cleansing for cleansing's sake or transforming for transforming's sake. Understand exactly what needs to be done and what's the best way to actually go about and do that. So in summary, as we said, the 10 steps that we have found from doing hundreds of these data migration projects, where we think if you follow these steps, it certainly helps you ensure the success of your data migration project. The first one, assess your data beforehand, understand what you've got and what you haven't got, understand how it's going to be used in the new system. Make sure that the validation and business rules are defined well, and that you spend time understanding what was happening in the legacy system versus what is going to happen in the new system, and understand the purpose that you're going to use this data for. And remembering that there may be multiple purposes for the same set of data. Different people may use this data for different things, and their requirements may be slightly different, and you need to understand that. And that's important then to understand who those people are that you need to talk to. Who is going to be responsible for this data once it goes into the new system? What processes are they going to follow to make sure that it stays business ready after go live, right? And make sure that they're involved during the data migration project. Don't just throw it over the fence at the end of the project and say, hey, it's yours now, off you go. Wipe your hands of it and walk away. Make sure that the people who are going to have to own this data after the project goes live are involved during the project. All right? Make sure that you have responsibility. At the end of the day, the people who are most affected by the data are the business users. Make sure that they are involved. Make sure that you've actually taken ownership for the validation. Understand that there are tools to help do it, but don't rely on them 100%. There will always be a need for human intellect to actually look at this data and make sure that it is actually correct and that it's business ready. And one of the ways to ensure that is to validate throughout the process. Do not leave it to the end. Make sure you set up regular validation steps. And as I said, one of the tools that we use for doing this is the Data Services Suite from SAP Business Objects, and that has very, very good reporting tools and reporting metrics in it, where you can keep track of the quality of the data as it goes through the various cleansing and iterations that you're going to go through. And then the final two things, as we said, make sure that the business is engaged. Data is not typically an IT issue. Data is a business issue. The people who are impacted are the business users. Yes, the system may not work if the wrong data is in there, but that impacts the business users more than it actually impacts IT. So make sure that the business is engaged throughout the course of the project. And finally, measure the impact. Make sure you understand what the impact of having good data is going to be, so what things you're going to be able to do that you couldn't do before because you've now got good data, but also understand what impact poor data is going to have on your new system as well. Make sure that people understand that if this particular field value isn't entered correctly, then it's going to impact five other people. Sometimes spending an extra hour early in the process getting the correct data into the system can save someone 3 days rework later on in the process if it's not right. Yeah. So I think one of the important things to understand, and you'll see the quote on the bottom of the page here, is that Gartner have done some surveys, and they identified that 83% of all data migration projects either fail outright or suffer significant overruns in both cost and or delays. I think the point of what we've been going through today is to try to give you some idea of some of the things that you can do to make sure that you're not in that 83% and that you're in the 17% of people that have really successful data migrations that are done on budget and on time. So with that, I would like to hand it back to Jodie, and we can talk about any questions that might have come up. Okay, so a couple of questions that have just come in is, what criteria do you use to determine if a data migration is successful or unsuccessful? And that's a difficult one to answer in some respects. My measure has always been, have the users accepted the system, and can they use the system as it was meant to be used with the data that was migrated, right? Migrating it on time, migrating it, before go live is a given. Just migrating the data on time, I don't believe is a measure of success. It's got to be that you migrated the right data, that you migrated it into the right place, and that the data that you've migrated has enabled the system to be used the way that it was intended to be used. Okay. Another question that just came in is, how do you handle legacy decommissioning and archiving after migration? That's an interesting one, because we often get asked the question, one of the most critical or one of the most common questions we get asked during data migration is, well, what about historical data? How do I move historical data over? I've got 5 years of information in my legacy system and I don't want to lose it. Unfortunately, up to recently, there wasn't a very good answer for that. The sort of choices that you had was to move it into your live system, which caused all sorts of problems with clogging up your live database with historical data, slowing down the performance of the new system, those sorts of things. You had other choices, which were to move the data into some sort of reporting tool, some sort of data warehouse. The problem with that, of course, is that data warehouses are typically used for reporting, not for looking at individual transactions. So you often had to increase the number of fields that were in the data warehouse. The data warehouses often contain aggregated values, not individual transactions. So then you had to change the layout of the warehouse to provide a transactional level storage as well. And that often resulted in increases in data warehouse sizes of 5 to 10 times over and above what you would normally have required just for reporting. The good news is that there is actually a process where we can actually use the same process that we've used for migrating current data and move it into an archive file. So once it's in an archive file, we can actually then use it looks like it had been archived out of the new system. So all of the normal access methods that are available, if we're talking about SAP, for instance, using the archive information system, or maybe some of the products that come from OpenText like document access, those sorts of things, so that you can now actually access the archive data from SAP, and the users really don't know any different. They don't know that it's an archive file. It hasn't actually slowed down the live system at all. So it actually gives them the feeling that they've been using SAP for 20 years, right? And in 5 years' time, they will see a combination of data that was coming from the legacy system and data that was archived out of the new system, and they really won't know where it came from in the first place. Yep. And one other question that's just came in was how best to budget for data migration. And once again, that depends on the complexity of your project, how long it is, that sort of stuff. But our typical sort of measure that we find is that the data migration will be somewhere in the order of 15 to 20% of what the total ERP implementation cost is going to be. That's really what you should be allowing for as a budget, somewhere in that order. If you've got a very, very complex system, it may be slightly higher, and if you've got a very simple application, then it may be slightly lower. But typical ranges we see are in the order of 15 to 20% for data migration, cleansing, conversion as part of the overall ERP implementation costs.
Thanks so much, Peter, for all of your help today in the presentation. Just a few notes before you leave today's webinar. Please remember to fill out the survey following the webinar. If you'd like to learn more about Utopia, please feel free to visit our website, utopiainc.com. Our contact information is up on the screen in one moment here. If you would like to reach us even further, you can call us at 847-388-3600 or drop us an email at info@utopiainc.com. Please feel free to email any suggestions for future topics. This webinar was recorded and will be available shortly. We look forward to you joining us at our next webinar. Thank you very much for your time and have a great day. Bye-bye.